This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Ann Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you future bold leaders. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Ann Pratt. I'm formerly from South Africa, and I relocated abroad to attend a Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative Fellowship in beautiful Boston in the United States of America. Today, our thoughtful bold leader joins us from Nairobi in Kenya. He was raised in rural Cameroon. He is a multiple award-winning environment and development policy thought leader, author, and keynote speaker. He holds multiple and notable credentials from the universities of Nottingham and Harvard. In 2023, he ranked in the top 50 global thought leaders on sustainability. Currently, he is the United Nations Environment Program Head of Global Environment Monitoring Systems. Previously, he was their Deputy Regional Director for Africa and Climate Change Coordinator for the continent. He has led climate resilience strategies and more than 100 innovation projects promoting climate action. He founded the Innovation Volunteerism Mentorship Program, which has inspired thousands of youth on the African continent to turn their passion into profits and environmental challenges into economic opportunities. Stay tuned as he shares with us his love of color, bright colors, and the meaning they convey, his rural childhood, innovative volunteerism, the antidote to disenfranchised youth, and how one can leverage traditional systems to drive innovation. We warmly welcome an African compatriot and friend I admire, respect, and applaud, Dr. Richard Munang, and welcome to Leading Boldly into the Future.
So, Richard, thank you so much for joining us from across the oceans today. I'm super excited to be having this conversation with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anne, for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Wonderful. I'd love to begin. You are passionate around the environment and the climate and the prospects for meeting this moment. Could you begin by sharing a little bit about what is your view around the current state of the environment and the planet?
Yeah, thanks again, Anne. I mean, the world is it's on a red alert. We have the COVID crisis that came and actually pulled back a lot of gains that have been made by countries, especially developing countries and Africa for that matter. And then the Ukraine-Russia war that saw inflation rose to levels never seen before, about 12.12% in the continent of Africa here. And then a lot of people went back from the progress they've made. They went back to poverty. They slipped back to frustration, and others are developing mental health. So when you put this together with a changing climate and ecological degradation, with pollution, killing over 9 million citizens across the entire world, and over 700,000 in the African continent, we need then to look at things differently. And I think when you put environment, because environment is not just about climate change, it's health. Sure. When you pollute the environment, you are causing death, you are causing sickness in humans, and a sick human being means your workforce is actually going to be affected. Environment is justice, because without a healthy environment, you will not have clean drinking water. And without clean drinking water, then you are condemning people not only to poverty, but at the same time, punishing them to not have the basic necessity that they have. Environment is food security. Environment is economics. because without the environment to provide the requisite services, then definitely our economical fundamentals will not necessarily be okay. So when you look at it from that perspective, then transformational development to address those triple crises that I mentioned, climate change, the COVID effects, and at the same time, the Ukraine war that has caused this inflation, and at the same time, the oil gas debate that has come to the fore, we need to leverage environmental resources.
Is there a particular moment, a day or time or an event that for you was a shocking moment of this truly is a red alert moment? When was that? What was that? And what was it? How did you feel at the time?
I think that back to where I was born in the northwestern part of Cameroon to a family of 5, and my parents are subsistence farmers. And we grew up actually in an informality. And that informality meant that at least we had to do what we do, depend on the little farm that my mother grew her crops. But unfortunately, these crops that were used to be sold to pay our school fees, to buy food and to buy clothing, failed most of the time because of lack of rain. And even when it rained, sometimes it came in a way that actually wipes away the little that has been grown. And that started to make me to think what was happening. And I think that was actually what sank in me when I was in primary school, went to secondary school, to high school, to university. I always thought, what can I do to be able to address this challenge that was inflicting pain in not just our family, but even our neighbors, and forcing us to beg for food sometimes and to drop out of school some years because we could not afford school fees. And so as a result of that, it became part and parcel of me not only to look for solutions, but to address a bigger problem, because as I finished university, I started to notice that it was not just a problem in my mother's farm. It was a problem in many mothers. And later on, I noticed it was not just a problem in Cameroon, but a problem in the world. And then I got a scholarship to study environmental science in Nottingham University in England. I focused in understanding what was then not understood, but understood at the time I was studying to be global warming. And I then focused on understanding the solutions that can actually be applied at the local communities, farmers applying that to avert the catastrophic incidences that I saw which affected our family. And so that became my moment of epiphany, because I was now in search of solutions to address a problem that was not common only to the community, but a global problem, but that impacts were felt at that level. Until today, it's always been in me that, yes, global challenges need solutions that are local sometimes, because to solve global problems, sometimes the agreements may be reached at a global level, which is very, very important because we need to bring everyone and every country on board. But what has always been the missing link is the translation to affect that common person at a grassroots level who needs it most and who is the most vulnerable. And so my moment, then from my mother's farm, crop failure, to all through, have always, anything I do everywhere, whether it is a project implementation or it's a policy discourse, I always put myself back to that stage when I saw crop failure in my mother's farm.
How old were you and how did you feel at the time?
I was 7 years old. And because this was not just a one-off, when I started noticing this, I was 7 years, but this started happening throughout until when I finished primary school. And even when I was at the university and came back home, most of the time, these challenges were still there. And that inflicted pain in terms of lack of food and lack of resources to pay our school fees and forcing us to beg. And it became worse. And so I noticed that it was not just a problem of our own home. It was a problem of many across the village, many across the province, many across the country. And later on, as I actually dig down on this when I was studying, I noticed that this is something that was quite very, very serious until today. It's only gotten worse. And that's why you see me, I developed a passion to do anything, using any space I am in, to provide and prefer solutions that can address that issue.
That's very powerful. If you look at the world today, Richard, and of course, environment and climate is right high up on the agenda. Are there any related big threats or opportunities that you see that are, equally important or very important for you? You know, what are the related knock-on effects of that also keep you concerned?
Actually, what keeps me concerned most is the youthful population. Because look, if you look across the entire world, I mean, the growing young population, and we put it within the context of Africa here today, it's a young continent. And even across the entire world, the young people seems not to have been understood by the leadership of now. And that worries me because most of them were born after the 90s. And they didn't grow up with the challenges of the Cold War or of colonization and countries fighting for independence. They were born at the era that transitioned to cell phone, to computers, and the understanding and thinking of solutions and even problems is completely different from what sometimes we see in public discourse spaces. And as a result of that, because they are not understood sometimes, it then means that they give up and become disenfranchised. And that disenfranchisement is a recipe for disaster because they are losing hope and sometimes losing faith, and then relegating back to not doing what is needed, whereas they're supposed to be leveraged as the workforce, as the social sovereign capital, to then be able to do what is needed today. Let me just take the example of Africa, a continent of 1.4 billion people with over 60% youthful. And at the same time, that youthful population is unemployed. If you do not leverage the youth, then there's absolutely nothing you can be able to achieve in the continent without leveraging them. So what I see as a threat is the youth unemployment. What I see as a threat is the wrong narrative sometimes that doesn't leverages the opportunities that youth can bring, but somehow make them not to see those opportunities or not to build on those opportunities. What worries me is that if you look at climate change, it wires through every problem. Whether we're talking about sustainable transformational development in terms of food security, the input will come from the youth, whether it is technology development to add value, to drive sustainable value chains, it's young people who can develop that. Whether we're talking about technological challenges, it is young people who provide the solutions, whether it's artificial intelligence or robotics, they are into this. And providing solutions to make or break, we need to leverage on the ingenuity and skills. Or whether we're talking about water wars and water stress, and every solution, technological solution, are going to be brought by the young people. But I don't see them being made to be at the center. They force themselves most of the time to be at the center. And that is a problem. Not all of them have that opportunity to be brought to the center. And because not all of them have that opportunity to be brought to the center, the few that get in there may not have the critical mass to be able to cause the transformational change that can happen. It therefore means we are losing opportunities, we're losing knowledge and new ways of doing things, creative thinking, and we're using that breath of fresh air that can solve the monumental challenges that the world needs now.
Yeah. And you know, to that point, Richard, I mean, in your mind, what do you think would be a progressive, proactive step to take to bring the youth to the center?
There are pockets of success stories across the world, and more so in the African continent today, that have actually, there are a lot of young people who are doing excellent, amazing work, but they are doing it in pockets, a few groups of young people or even individually. But we need a critical mass within a very collective system that can then be able to move beyond the mindset of thinking that you must have money or you must have resources to start, but to a mindset of inspiring people to self-believe. Because one of the things that I think have been absent in the world, not only for young people, even for the elderly people, is that we have discussed challenges of the global community from the perspective of lack, rather than from the perspective of using what we have to get what we don't have. And that have then dissuaded and discouraged a lot of people to sit back when they don't have the opportunities. And what we have done is, how can we be able to leverage on the passion? Because money cannot buy passion and money cannot buy dedication. An inspired human being and a passionate human being can be able to do wonders. Because if you throw trillions on someone who is not passionate, nothing will happen. But you give ideas to a passionate person, he can be able to move mountains. And it is based on this simple premise that the idea of innovative volunteerism was born. It was born from the perspective that how do you address challenges of over 900 million young people who don't have opportunities? No amount of project with money will be able to solve that. But you can then be able to have a common framework in which each and everyone brings his or her talent, but get that talent turned into a skill and that skill turned to value. By doing what we did was inspiring them through lectures, through guidance in frameworks which we created, and using social media to ensure that at least a young person in Uganda who has knowledge of turning agricultural waste into fuel briquette can be connected to a young person in Ghana, to a young person in Zambia, to a young person in Chad. And we created an incubation hub that has resulted today in not only developing these clean solutions of waste to briquette, developing clean energy solutions like solar dryers for mothers to dry their vegetables as they make money and solve community problems. But we've created a critical mass of climate action solution providers who today are creating their businesses out of this. And it is a process that is now helping to inspire more young people who are now learning from those experiences. And what is needed as a result of that is that there is a proof of concept. We now need policy incentives, physical incentives that can then help young people to then be able to take this to the higher level. I think this is the best way to build solutions so that at least we can engage broader scope of young people, but ensure that at least they take charge of what they do, but do it in a way that solves economic problems, environmental problems, and social problems.
So what is your definition of innovative volunteerism?
It's a very simple idea of engaging. It's a tool that leverages on the passion of an individual. So for example, if Anne is passionate about journalism, of telling stories, what Anne needs to do in the process of innovative volunteerism is how do you, because you already is a professional in journalism or have expertise in journalism, start to tell stories of solutions that help a mother in a village in a way that she sees that she can be able to put food on the table. And that story you are telling is now moving beyond just news, but to now a solutions-oriented approach that can help inspire that mother to move away from depending on charcoal to depending on a clean solution like fuel briquettes that reduces indoor pollution, saves some money because it is cheaper, and at the same time ensure that there is no pollution choking her lungs and killing her kids. If it is a young person who has done carpentry, how can that young person be guided so that at least you start developing his passion now to start making solar dryers rather than just being a carpenter to be zinking and roofing roofs, but move that passion that he or she has with a skill he or she have got to apply it in developing a solution. So the simple definition of innovative volunteerism is inspiring people to turn their passions into profits as they solve problems through the environmental lens and create businesses, but at the same time put money in the pocket and food on the table.
That's a wonderful concept, Richard. I'm just curious about the word volunteerism. I wasn't clear on what that meant.
The logic of innovative volunteerism and the logic of volunteerism is completely different. If you look across the entire world today, and I've argued this so many times, the multiplicity of the challenges we have will not be solved even if we were to have all the resources that are needed. It's people who drive solutions. If you do not have people with the skills and the passion to do what is needed, you throw money, nothing will work. But at the end of the day, it is the individual that can voluntarily volunteer his or herself to do something. And if you cannot voluntarily volunteer yourself to do something, no matter what is done, it will not be sustainable and it will not even work. And therefore, the idea was you cannot force people to do what they don't want. You must be able to guide and inspire them. And that is why you see me using social media, providing perspective, providing solutions. Those who are excited and get inspired volunteer to ask, volunteer to inquire. And when they inquire in alliance with their passion, they voluntarily volunteer to learn. And when they learn, they can then be able to build something out of that. And so the traditional volunteerism of people just coming to learn sometimes for social endeavor end up maybe have experience, but do not do it because they really wanted to do it and there was no passion in it. So innovative volunteerism is a new concept that ensures that we all play our part in what we like, but in the solutions process, we build something that put money on the table, on our pockets, and food on the table as we solve communal challenges.
I love it. So it's about volunteering to act, to learn, and to lead.
Absolutely. And to
fueled by
then in the process, correct.
and turn passion into profit. I really love it. To what extent has this, energized people on the African continent? Do you have any numbers around that? How well is this movement doing, and how many people have taken this call to action?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a beautiful question. I think over 10,000 young people have picked up these ideas, and I'm talking those who are actually doing something, because one of the myths that have been projected for over 60 years that I actually think it's a big problem that is not discussed across the entire world is that there have not actually been discussions around what can we do with what we have, not what we don't have.
Yeah.
There've not been discussions on we can only get what we don't have by using what we have. And I think this very simple premise that sounds somehow simplistic, it's a very big way of doing things that actually have not been championed to make people understand. And so they've always been that kind of misconstruing of reality from the perspective that if you are not supported first, you cannot do something.
Yeah.
And that this is a disabler and dissuade. It doesn't inspire. And so you see well-to-do young people who are talented, energetic, passionate, but get shut down by that belief that they cannot start because they are not supported. Whereas is the opposite. That you can start to help a mother even understand how she plant her maize in her farm. To learn to do that, in the course of doing that, you might be able to just understand that the waste that come out of that farm, whether it is maize cobs or whether it is cassava peelings, can actually be used to turn to back fertilizer. And as a result of these, I took almost 2 years trying to explain these through academic lectures, university lectures, secondary school lectures. As we were doing this, we were practically showcasing on the ground in Uganda, leveraging the local structure of the Buganda kingdom, which have over 12 million people. And the reason for doing that was that these local structures in the continent have not been leveraged to drive transformational environmental solutions. But whereas the local governance structures have immense powers in terms of the fact that the king of these kingdoms, once he says everybody should move away from charcoal to briquette, everybody takes up. So it's a policy. If he says everybody should move away from using chemicalized fertilizers to using organic fertilizer, everybody picks that up. And when we engage them, we were bringing solutions, environmental solutions of clean energy, solar dryers, fuel briquettes. And the idea was we want to engage young people to showcase how this works. And when we engage young people to showcase how this work, it then fed into the kingdom, which then in Uganda today, everybody is using nature-based solutions. And the youth there have actually picked this up, and they are now helping to train youth in Kenya, youth in Ghana, youth in Cameroon, and the youth in Nigeria are helping to train youth in Ghana, helping to train youth in Zambia. And why I'm bringing this up is that because of what has actually been there before, that people cannot do something if they don't have what it takes to do in terms of money. It's a process because we are actually trying to reshape mindsets to see that opportunities will come when you start with what you have. And that is an opportunity because you are not de-risking yourself so that investors can invest in you because you can prove that you've done something with very little. And I think this is the best formula that can actually make everybody to know that he or she has something to offer.
That's such a powerful point, Richard. And I'm curious to know, so in the Kingdom of Uganda, can you just, what was the moment when you thought this is the way forward, and who were the stakeholders that helped energize this initiative in Uganda?
Actually, growing up in the small village of Jinko in the northwestern part of Cameroon. I grew up, it's an informal setting. So to be very honest, up to 80% of the entire continent is in the informal setting. The informality of the continent is from the perspective that most people live in rural areas. In these rural areas, they depend on subsistence agriculture. They do not have access to electricity. And over 620 million Africans do not have access to electricity. So you can imagine 620 million plus in informal sectors. And the informality sometimes is not leveraged, but the fact that they don't have access to electricity, the fact that they don't have access to formal banking, they also have local accessible structures and systems that they depend on. They have kingdoms, they have what is called cooperatives where they save their own money. They use social trust and social systems to be able to use that trust and contribute money to support one another, to either buy school uniform or to either buy food or to even buy inputs into the farm. This is something that is quite very established. And when you look at these social structures and social governance structures, which where I grew up, there was a chief that ruled the community that could give instruction that everybody needs to get out and clean on weekends. So with that mindset, understanding that background, I have been in this space of climate change for the past 13 years. And I've always asked myself, the discussion about this informal leverage of systems have never actually been at the forefront. And I wanted that we should do something different. And Uganda is actually very rich in kingdoms. The kingdoms are very solid and they are huge. And Buganda Kingdom is one of the biggest kingdoms in Uganda. And as a result of what we were doing from the work we've done across the continent and working with stakeholders in Uganda, the civil society, the NGOs, through the framework of innovative volunteerism, there were actors who voluntarily volunteered to start doing what we were driving. So we leveraged them and they engaged the kingdom. And from the kingdom, they engaged the biggest local cooperative where there are people who save money, but they also have activities in their farms. So what we started doing was that those cooperatives that have over 5 million people in them could then be used as an accountability and traceability entry point to reach 5 million people with solutions that help them use organic fertilizer, that help them adopt solar dryers that the youth were developing. And as we're speaking today, these systems are called village savings and loan associations. So at the community level, the village savings and loan associations, if they are growing cassava, most of them grow cassava before they used to dry it on the ground and it gets spoiled. But now, because of solar dryers that young people are fabricating and decentralizing to them, they dry it within 2 days rather than 7 days as compared before, and it's not contaminated, and they're turning it to cassava flour. Then they market it and save back the money in the cooperative. So they're making more money. They are having food on the table. The young people are also making money because the solar dryers, they're decentralizing. They charge a fee, or the village savings and loan association buy it off. It's creating jobs. So the point I am trying to make is that when you don't leverage these systems of traceability and accountability, it becomes very difficult to monitor. It becomes very difficult to measure impact. And at the same time, the ownership diminishes when resources are not there. And these are the lessons that we're picking up through these systems of innovative volunteerism. And more importantly, these structures of kingdoms, local governance structures, have always embraced this logic of innovative volunteerism. Because in the community is not money that is needed to be able to solve, to construct a road or to ensure that a fixing of either it rains, flooding, to open up pathways so that there's no flooding. So with that spirit, it was very easy to tap into that so that at least people can embrace it. And the innovative volunteerism that I mentioned now was more important for young people to provide the inputs that I've mentioned: solar dryers, fabrication, turning agricultural waste into biofertilizer, which replaces chemicalized fertilizers that are being used by these associations and communities. And at the same time, the young people are making money.
That's fantastic. And to what extent, how many kingdoms are involved? Which kingdom is it?
In this, so in Uganda is the Buganda Kingdom. That's where we start, but we hope to spread this to many other. As I said before, and I'll go back to that again. Change can be incremental, especially when you are moving, you're trying to bring a logical approach to things that have not been the norm. Like I am pushing very strongly in every space the informality of the African continent, because every discussion is as if Africa is actually an urbanized continent. But informality, even in urban cities, cannot be ignored. In slums, you see a lot of cities do have slums, with almost 80% of the citizens in those cities still living in those slums. So you cannot call them urban dwellers. They are still informal, even in the formal city. So what is happening is that the data that has come out of this, because data is very important, has helped to inform the policy on how these produce that are using this system. For example, the Uganda National Bureau of Standards have now developed a standard on how you produce working with the environment, how you dry without emissions, using the data that is coming out of this work that we're doing through innovative volunteerism, and has developed what is called a market incentive standard, which means that the farmers and the young people who are producing what they're producing will now have a benchmark, which is an incentive in that if that benchmark is followed, then their goods and products can even go beyond Uganda to the entire East African region. And for the first time in the entire African continent, the solar dryer standard is being developed. And so these are policy changes that are happening gradually. And then at the same time, in Nigeria, in Nasarawa State Emirates have picked this up. So because you asked how many kingdoms. So we have the Buganda Kingdom. So in West Africa, in Nigeria, the Nasarawa State Emirates picked this up, but did it in a different way. Gather young people to be trained to turn agricultural waste into fuel briquettes and fertilizer, and develop solar dryers, which are now decentralized to help women dry their cassava. But more importantly, I've used those young people to train other communities and other families so they can produce their own briquettes from the waste. And this data has helped inform the development of a school curriculum at the university level in Nasarawa State University, which means that these pockets of successes of climate entrepreneurship in terms of developing, turning waste to fertilizer, to briquettes to replace charcoal, developing solar dryers, will now be taught formally in school. And this course is called Climate Action Entrepreneurship.
That's fantastic. So about 10,000 people are engaged in these initiatives right now. Right. Yeah, and it's remarkable the work you're doing, Richard. I noted in your book, you also speak about Africa having been thought of historically as the dark continent. Around 2010, it was, Africa rising. Where do you think, and also coupled with that, Africa seems to have greater challenges in terms of global warming vis-a-vis the rest of the world. If you look at the kind of average rising temperature and global warming of 1.5 versus 2.2 to 2.4 in Africa in terms of projected trends, where do you think Africa is today?
I think Africa of today is better than the Africa of the 60s, the 50s, the 70s, the 80s. And I have always argued that if we do not appreciate progress, we can never make progress. Because despite the fact that progress can be incremental, it also can act as an impetus to propel more progress. But when you look at the changing climate, as you rightly put it, Africa is warming fast as twice as the rest of the world. And we can see this in the floods, the droughts in the Horn of Africa, where over 22 million people don't have food. They've lost their cattle, their animals, that have costed them over 300 million US dollars in just cattle. But when you look at the impact, just 2 weeks ago, Nigeria suffered the worst floods in all 33 states. So the lives lost cannot be quantified in terms of money. And when you look at this, I think this is now becoming a heavy burden for the continent, because resources allocated for health and education are now used to address droughts, to ensure that at least people can have emergency relief. to ensure that at least those who have been affected by floods can have, and this is putting the continent in an economic distress because then they have little physical space, and at the same time, with the climate challenge, the development challenge, it becomes quite very, very difficult. But this is what I think needs to be done. Every challenge is a disguised opportunity. And you don't waste any moment that you can seize an opportunity. A crisis should never be wasted, whether it is a climate crisis or it is the COVID crisis that came, or it is the crisis that is coming as a result of the Ukraine-Russia war. Let me start with the Ukraine-Russia war. The increase in wheat prices provided an opportunity for the continent to look to and tap into our own indigenous crops. Cassava is a crop that I've called it is the gold of Africa. It's consumed
sorry,
by over
Richard,
5.
can you just explain what that crop is? Because I don't think everyone's familiar with that.
Right. So cassava actually is a crop that actually is grown in the continent and mostly in the Sahel and some pockets of areas that are dry across the continent. But it's mostly grown in dry areas or in wet areas. And it produces a tuber that can actually be turned into flour, into cassava flour. It can be turned into cassava bread, into cassava cake. The leaves can actually be consumed by animals, and the stems can actually be used in the place of firewood. And it can produce 300 products. It can cassava beer, cassava cakes, 300 products.
Wow.
But this is a crop that is a climate resilient crop, and there are studies that have shown that wheat is going to reduce by about 34% as a result of the changing climate in the globe, but cassava will only be affected by 8%. But more importantly is that leveraging cassava will be an opportunity because it has a global market of over 22 billion US dollars, but it's not being tapped into. It therefore means in the face of crisis, Africa can actually tap into this opportunity. It will not only be able to address food insecurity, but also reduce the depreciation of their foreign reserve in importing wheat when in the first place, their foreign reserves are quite very little because of the calamities of climate change. They're using their resources now to address these aspects, and just coming out of COVID, they are in economic distress. That's one. Two is that biggest employment sector in the continent is agriculture. 65% of the workforce is employed in agriculture. So if you are to expand the value chain of cassava to add value, you will be creating jobs. And at the same time, you are actually going to then be able to export a finished product, which will fetch you more money. But this is what we've been pushing because it can address food insecurity, create jobs, and at the same time tap into the market of over 22 billion. The second aspect, which I think is very, very important, because this was about the Ukraine war. During COVID, what happened was that the continent was being fed by the rural area actors. Food was imported from rural areas to the city. But when you look at most of the food that comes to the city, it gets spoiled because the local communities do not have either access to a solar dryer that they can dry their vegetables and actually reduce spoilage, or solar power fridges that they can be able to store their tomatoes. If you walk across Africa countries, you will see tomatoes by the side of the road. At the end of the day, when they don't buy them, they get thrown away. That's food thrown away. That's money thrown away. And when they have access to these inputs, which young people can actually be given incentive to create their businesses around this by government, that can then be decentralized to solve this problem. It will then be able to create jobs for young people, but at the same time, also help reduce post-harvest losses that are costing the continent every year 48 billion US dollars. And the continent is importing food worth over 35 billion US dollars. That is importing unemployment and exporting employment. That is now COVID. Then now to the changing climate. When you look at the changing climate, the solutions to the changing climate outweighs the problem for the African continent. Why do I say so? Just look at the energy challenge. The continent have the best solar power resource on Earth, but only 1% of that is being tapped and decentralized. That means 99% of utilizing Africa's solar has not happened. The price of solar is coming down. The continent, as I started off by saying, that Africa's informality cannot be ignored. 620 million energy impoverished can access energy through off-grid, because if you focus on grid, focus on gas, you are not going to reach these 620 million people, because they're in areas that even grid electricity cannot go to. So it is using solar that can be able to reach them. But it's not just about electricity. It's also about cooking. Cooking, over 84% of Africans depend on clean cooking. We're talking about 920 million. That is killing Africans every year. 700,000 Africans die because of indoor pollution. This is a huge number that is not even reported. This number is higher than the number of those who died with COVID, but every life lost matters. But just to compare, but moving them to clean cook stoves, incentivizing young people to get to businesses of developing clean cook stoves will create jobs and solve a health problem. Incentivizing young people to create businesses that they cannot pay taxes for over 5 years, giving them tax holidays, in turning agricultural waste into biogas that can be utilized by communities, which we have tested this in Cameroon, and it is actually creating jobs for young people and helping communities just by turning in organic waste from their house, and also helping to turn this to fuel briquettes will replace charcoal and tap into a market of charcoal in the continent that is worth 20 billion. But this thinking needs to really sink them there, that you see, I'm just talking billions. Charcoal industry, 20 billion. Cassava industry, over 22 billion. Food whose harvest losses, 48 billion. Then at the end of the day, the resources Africa needs to transform are actually with them. They just need to become smart to seize that using climate action solutions.
It's incredibly innovative, inspiring. I guess the question that comes to mind, Richard, to what extent is government stepping in? To what extent have you been able to change the thinking of governments, to change policies, and to reallocate resources?
Excellent question. I mean, firstly, the governments of Africa have done excellent when it comes to climate policy. I mean, African countries ratified the Paris Climate Change Agreement that was adopted in December 2015. 52 countries out of 54 ratified. They put in place simple plans to drive development in a low emission development way, called the Nationally Determined Contributions, NDCs. 52 out of 54 countries actually developed those and ratified. That is massive progress, more than any other part of the world. Now they are revising those plans, and 45 countries in the continent have revised the plan with ambition more than any other country in the world. But yet, the continent is only emitting between 3 to 4%. So when it comes to policy, Africa is actually a leader. But this is where the difference comes in. Implementation, turning those policies into reality, to make meaningful changes has been a big problem. And this is what we've been doing through the work we do. Is if you look at the way the continent is set up, if actions are only carried through the lens of formal drivenness, we will still be losing a lot because of the informality of the continent. So what we are doing is we are helping to ensure that these plans and policies that are in place, how do we help countries develop investment plans? Because out of all these climate action plans, 72% of them have not been turned into investment plans. And what are these investment plans? For example, every country have got agriculture, sustainable agriculture in their policy. They've got clean energy. They've got clean transport. What does this entail? What we are doing is that if you're talking about sustainable agriculture, what you need to do is not to talk about it alone, is to talk about it within the context of energy that can add value. And this is where what I call competitive energy. Energy is not just for lighting. It should also be used to add value, to help make sure that at least cassava can be processed, it can be dried in a solar dryer, it can actually be turned into flour using clean energy solutions. And so we are helping governments to showcase how these linkages can happen, and also develop what we call a blended finance facility, which goes back to the point.
So I have to just ask you, which governments are responding and which governments are actually taking action?
Actually, you see, this process is new that have started just within 2-3 years, because the NDC is a new paradigm shift of implementing. And we are using test cases so that at least the lessons out of that we can share them across the continent. We're working with Ghana, we're working with Uganda, we're working with Morocco. But then we're also working with youth with this logic so that at least they can also push their governments to pick this up, regardless of where they are. But the point is more about the logic, because I think what can work and make impactful changes in one government can become like a mosaic or a prototype that can then be leveraged by others to do so. And so,
is there a government that is at the kind of cutting edge of that? And if so, which one?
Ghana is quite ahead, and Uganda. But there are some governments that have actually moved ahead to do things in a way that fits into this, like Kenya. Kenya is actually giving tax incentives to people who are developing clean energy solutions. And this is the kind of logic that we're saying young people are turning agricultural waste into fuel briquettes. Kenya, in their finance bill of 2021, gave tax incentives, taking off VAT, value-added tax of 16% on any action that was resulting to clean energy solutions, developing biogas and briquettes. Most countries are doing this, but what we are saying is that's a piecemeal approach. You need to do it broadly within a holistic, transformational, connectable way that at least attract more investors. For example, we're talking about e-mobility, electric vehicles. A lot of investors are going to invest in a country that have actually put an enabling policy in terms of providing charging points across the country. That means that the private sector will not have to use money in putting up charging points of e-vehicles, but they can then be able to leverage what government has already done and bring in more e-vehicles. And government can also set up training institutions to train young people so that at least they can learn how to fix those e-vehicles. So you will see the enabling environment with little action catalyzing investment, and that is the kind of dimension we are bringing. The same in agriculture.
Yeah, I was just curious. I'm curious to know, and I understand it philosophically, but I'm curious to know which, you made the point earlier that you need pockets of excellence and proof of concept to help motivate and persuade governments to play their part. It sounds like Ghana and Uganda are making strides, and Kenya has actually got some good tax incentive structures. So I was curious at a very practical level to understand which of these governments are making more strides, and how is that then shaping their economies and perhaps influencing other governments.
Ghana is actually moving with the e-mobility, that's e-vehicles. They've developed an e-vehicle policy, and at the moment they are moving into how to put in place these charging points. So it's a process. Policy is a process, but they're moving in that direction. Then Uganda is working on developing the blended finance, which is how do you leverage local structures like cooperatives to address the informal and microfinance, and at the same time public finance, so that at least it can then de-risk the whole system to bring in private sector investment, so that a cooperative that can be able to afford a solar dryer and don't have a lot of money can actually be able to get money from a microfinance that the government instrument help to guarantee that in case of default, they can cover that up. That's the simplistic, logical way we are trying then to bring together. So local financial institutions engaging with micro financial institutions and the central bank and national banks, but with government playing the role of de-risking, and at the same time ensuring that those who also assess those resources at a very low interest rate. That's what we are developing. And these are 4 components. The first is working with local cooperatives, which are forgotten in the process of financing, but also linking them up to microfinancing to work together, because there are some outlays of financing that they cannot be able to handle, but they can get it, but not as individual, but as a structured group that can then be able to channel to address challenges on the ground. And more importantly, linking up to the big banks that can then be able to engage in heavy aspects like e-mobility but with the government playing the role to de-risk and attracting investors to come in and fit into the process.
Yeah, no, gosh, Richard, you've certainly taken on a remarkable challenge. Who've been your greatest allies in this process?
The greatest allies in this process have actually been the young people. I think there has been a kind of a void that I've noticed, that at least they've heard the usual all the time, but they've not have that disruptive ways of seeing things done differently, not traditionally. And most of them, though it's taken some of them some time to come on board, most of them now are embracing these solution space because they are seeing that the traditional ways have not actually made any difference, regardless of how long they've stayed in that sport. And so they're picking that up. And not only young people in Africa, but even across the globe. I get reached out by young people in India. I get reached out by young people in Europe and even the United States, in Canada. They love what is happening. And now that question then is very important to ask, because what I've actually noticed, if you cannot actually show something, which means that you have to belabor a lot in the process to have a product, a lot of people might not actually trust what you've been saying. And so what I want to say is that the young people embracing and getting to be part of this process and giving their testimonials have been not just inspirational, but a motivating aspect that has kept me going.
That has kept you going. I love that. And actually, on that note, Richard, I did see all the wonderful birthday video that was put together for you by so many of the young voices that you connect with. And I felt, you know, their love and admiration for you. So I could only imagine when I was listening to it that in and of itself is a great fuel for your purpose and passion. You know, in your book, you also alluded to some of the challenges of Africa, but also some of the great voices and leaders of Africa. And of course, we have the late Kofi Annan, the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu. We have Nelson Mandela. What for you has been a Mandela moment for you? A moment, a specific event, watching a film, reading a book, you know, meeting him. What has been a particular moment for you that stands out in your mind when Mandela's example inspired you, shaped you, or helped you reflect in some way?
The aspect of seeing communities start to believe that they can use their local structures to drive their own funding, because I think one of the biggest challenge has been that of lack of self-belief sometimes. And so the fact that you have the ideas and the knowledge, and you keep pushing these ideas, and there's always this language of there's no money, there is no money. Of course, it's true, there is no money. But when people finally believe that we have what it takes, no matter how small it is. This was when I was in Uganda, and I met these great, amazing mothers who were saying that they don't have money. And when I explained to them how they can use their cooperative, which is called PEOSA, and it is one of the biggest cooperatives in the Buganda Kingdom, to be able to leverage little resources to invest in clean solutions to add value. And I could see them saying they have never thought of that. And I went back again after 2 months, and they were singing and showing me how they have dried their cassava as a result of accessing a solar dryer and saving more back. I felt so proud and excited. And that was my Mandela moment, because I could see the connection of young people bringing a solution of a solar dryer. I could see the connection of a communal structure being leveraged to assess finance. And also I could see the solution of mothers in the community self-believing that they can self-sustain. And that was really something that was quite very, very impactful. And it gave me that hope, and that we can be able to do this, so that at least as we connect into the global architecture, the continent can actually be bringing solutions that are relatable to people in the informal sector. Like I said, the informality of the continent seems sometimes forgotten. But when I see the informality, the informal sector rediscovering themselves to bring solutions that can be copied elsewhere, That was my Mandela moment.
And for you personally with Mandela, I mean, your own connection with Nelson Mandela?
I think Nelson Mandela is actually, he is to me an epitome of excellence, and at the same time a reflection of selflessness and an embodiment of what humanity should stand for, which is we are all the same regardless of how we look. We can do everything for the common good of one another, and in it we all benefit rather than lose. And I think that kind of attitude seems somehow to be missing.
Yeah.
And we need that more at the moment, especially with the triple planetary crisis of climate change, of pollution, of biodiversity. And on top of that, these elements of COVID, of the war that we're seeing in Ukraine, and more importantly, the unemployment that we're seeing around the world. The Mandela epitomization of humanity and selflessness and kindness and the ability to not work for self, but do that touches the lives of millions is actually what we need today. And that always is a reflection of anything that I do, that we must be selfless in the process. We must move from individualism to collectivism. We must move from thinking that from selfishness to selflessness, and we must be responsible in anything that we do, because a life touch means we have lived a better life.
Yeah, that's very, very powerful. And of course, you've had many moments of connecting with Mandela through various different media. Does one moment stand out for you, Richard? I mean, was it when he walked out of what was then called Victor Verster prison? Was it his inauguration day? In 1994, is there a particular reference point that you have?
Yes, I think when I won the United Nations Environment Program Baobab Award, and I was the first African to ever win that. And when I stood on that stage, what came to my mind was, is it really about me that I've won this? Or is it, was it worthy of me to win this? Or it was the people out there who made it possible for me to win this? And then I dedicated that to them, and I felt just great. And I thought that was really something that I could relate it to be the Mandela moment.
And your connection to Mandela in that moment, was it because of his relationship with the United Nations and the fact that the UN have named his birthday as an International Mandela Day? I mean, what was the bridge between that moment and the connection back to Mandela?
It was thinking beyond self, that our success is not necessarily for us. It's about what we do for others. And that even when you are rewarded, or even when you grow in your career, it's not about you. It should always be that what can you do more to solve the problems for others to be better. And I think it's a sense of responsibility that every good or bad moment should be about us reflecting on what we can do if we were to live the next day. And whether it is awards or it is promotions, we always reflect to think about others, and especially others in terms of providing solutions, not causing problems, especially others in terms of inspiring them to self-believe, because inspiration is very important, and motivation to make others who never have an opportunity to be where one is, to see that they can actually rise up to be there. And that when they're there, it's not about them, it's about others, because together we are stronger.
Absolutely. Where did you learn many of your insights about Mandela?
I read about Mandela when we were growing up, especially when we were taught about apartheid in school, in primary and secondary school. And the understanding of who Mandela was, because he was a hero, an icon that everybody knew when he was released from prison. The fact that he was in prison for 27 years is quite mind-blowing, that everybody started to ask, how can a human being be in prison for 27 years? And even when we were taught about this in school, so we actually got, excited to understand. And so I read about him to understand his life and who he was and what he stood for, and also to understand what was driving him throughout all those tribulations. And I think it actually became an inspiration. And actually, in the books that I do have, I have a book on Mandela, which I always go back to read.
Which one?
The autobiography of Mandela.
The Long Walk to Freedom. A
Correct.
Long Walk to Freedom. Yeah.
The Long Walk
yeah.
to Freedom, yes.
And just out of interest, I'm curious. So when do you pick up that book? When do you draw on the book and the insights?
You know, when I finished my PhD, I couldn't afford to buy it. Yes, when I finished my PhD and started working, then I ordered the book. But we were taught a bit about it, but I needed to have one that I can always go through and read. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. And in your moments when you feel you need to go back and remind yourself, Richard, when are those moments for you? Are they moments of indecision? Are they moments of anxiety? Are they moments, what triggers you to go back into the book?
You know, actually, the world is full of challenges, and I always say this. So, crisis upon crisis are bound to come anytime. So sometimes you give your best in situations and you don't achieve the intended outcome you wanted to, and
Yeah.
you feel like giving up. So you get back to look, if when Mandela went through all this and could still come out and was strong and excited and inspired people, then this is nothing. And so that becomes more inspirational. But more importantly, I always think of the aspect that I mentioned, the selflessness, because what makes people to give up is when they don't have a purpose. Because the purpose of life is to be useful, and our usefulness is not for our own self; it's for others. And in whatever thing that we do it to make others' lives better. Then we are useful. And if what we do doesn't go as we want, we change the way we are doing it, but the ultimate end goal have to be the same. And that is something that I always do.
In moments when you need to refill your own cup of inspiration, are those moments when you go back and draw on those insights and lessons?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. So do you think Mandela's leadership example is relevant today? And if so, what do you think he would say to Africa today?
I think his examples are needed and more relevant today than even then, because I think the challenges then were not as many as they are today. Like I started off by saying, the world is on a red alert. We have climate change, we had war, the Ukraine war, countries are just recovering from COVID. And on top of that, there are just multiplicity of other challenges, environmental challenges, apart from climate change, pollution, that is polluting our oceans, waste, ecological degradation. And I think what Mandela has always done, I mean, the people, first of all, need to be calm and self-belief. I think it's about self-belief that we can do it. And actually, he fought to ensure that there was no injustice. And I think the injustice when it comes to climate change today would say Africa have least contributed to the problem of climate change. Mothers and children are dying every day because of drought and floods. And this is as a result of the changing climate that is actually turbocharging and supercharging these floods, cyclones. They do not need to suffer even when they survive this. They should be supported, and the rich countries that have a pledge to do this should do that. I believe Mandela would say so, because an injustice can never be able to inspire a young person who is growing up in a world that is so unjust, can never unleash his or her potential. That a mother dying as a result of lack of an alternative clean fuel to cook is not her fault. It's just because she doesn't have an alternative, and that we need to be able to provide the resources to ensure that you can be able to have that. So I think a message will be on injustice, 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 and how to turn that to justice.
Yeah. How to turn that to justice. So in the work you're doing, and based on your experience across the African continent, and of course you work, you know, within a global community within the United Nations, what do you think would be one first step to turn the injustice into justice?
First step is inspiration. A lot of people are so uninspired and they have given up. There is an immense power in people to self-believe that they can actually be able to do something. There is a lot of giving up in the world. People are actually giving up, and the most dangerous world is one in which people have given up, because then a human being who is uninspired is more dangerous than any other thing you can ever think of, because he or she can do anything. And on top of that, that is a loss to the world, because the biggest capital is sovereign capital and is human capital. To inspire people to self-believe doesn't need that much. It's about transparency. When we say we do things, we do them. When we fail our citizens, we come back to them and apologize and start from afresh and show that it was not intended.
Yeah.
When pledges are made to address challenges that are of a global common, they should be honored. When everybody is treated the same regardless of how you look and given the same opportunity, we will have a world that is united and peaceful. But what I have seen through the work we do is what I am saying. People just need to be inspired, especially the young people. They have given up. And then the false narrative sometimes that they cannot do it because they are not able makes them disenfranchised. And what I've learned in the process is that positive narrative inspires. And a passionate person can be able to do that, which even 20 unpassionate people cannot do. Imagine in a world today, almost 8 billion, having 8 billion passionate people. All these challenges we're mentioning today will be solved in less than 5 years.
That's an incredibly positive note of inspiration. So here are a couple of fun facts, Richard. What inspired you the most? What moment can you go back to which really lit the fire for your inspiration?
Actually finished my degree and I was volunteering in an NGO in the northwestern part of Cameroon. And in the course of volunteering, I was applying for scholarships, and the focus and my motivational statement was to look at this issue of crop failure in my mother's farm. And I finally got that scholarship after 3 attempts. That moment I will never forget, because immediately I got the scholarship, I knew that my dream has been realized from the perspective that I can actually study and come up with a solution that can address a challenge that is impacting millions. Anytime I think of that, I think that was when the key was handed to me, to either use it to open a door or to lock a door. But I use it to open a door.
You've opened a very wide door, Richard. Just another fun fact, going back to your village, can you share with us a childhood moment? What was one of your most joyful childhood moments?
Oh, wow, amazing. Amazing, and I miss that today. When we were growing up, and that tradition has gradually gone down, not as it was during our time. At the age of 5, we were gathered around the fireside every evening to be told stories of our great-grandfathers, to be told, given stories of how things used to happen, how people used to survive adversary, how people used to be able to survive in things they were not capable of doing. And we were taught proverbs. And if you notice, I use a lot of African proverbs. I learned them, most of them during that time. Idiomatic expression to be able to pass a message that is quite heavy in meaning, but at the same time done in a very subtle way. Those moments, to me, I miss them today, but I believe they are what formed me to be who I am, because that setting of always relating back to that village style of doing things in relating to people, to the common person, was formed during those moments of my teenage years.
That's wonderful. And the third sort of fun fact, share with us where you bought that beautiful, bright, joyful shirt, and where is it from?
Actually, I love fashion, and what made me to really love fashion is that, as I said, we grew up in a poor home. That's not a problem. But went to school without shoes, had only one uniform, and the idea was always, if I was ever to afford, regardless when, I will always like to put something that tells a meaning. So this shirt, because I love fashion, I actually scanned through the internet, tried to look at different combinations of African print, and said, okay, I come from Cameroon with a flag, green, red, yellow. I would love to do something that represents the flag of the country, but also represent a kind of a traditional dress from where I come from, the Northwestern, they call it Tongo. So Tongo is a traditional wear that comes from that particular region. And it has different colors. It have the gong. So the gong is used to it was used in those days to pass a message in a village. For example, when you use that gong and hit it, it's like you hit it, people will either understand that there was an emergency, that the chief of the village wanted people to gather. And so the stripes, as you see them like this, some of them represent a stick that was held by the elder. Some of these stripes represent stars that are supposed to be like a vision for many people. So if I was to stand up, you will see there is a gong down here. So wearing this dress and the color yellow is hope. So colors are important. Anytime I wear yellow is when I want to project hope. If I wear green, I'm talking about something on agriculture and the environment that is so important that I really want people to understand. And if I wear orange, it's to inspire at the same time, but pass a very authoritative message. Then if I wear red, it's almost the same like orange, though I hardly wear red, but you see me more in yellow, which is hope and inspiration, green, an environmental message that need to be passed with the gravitas and the gravity that it deserves. And those are the kind of colors that I wear.
And red, what does red mean?
Red is to pass an authoritative message in an unruly crowd that may not want to hear, but do it in a way that at least when you leave the stage, people will still say, oh, you had a point. But I hardly wear red because the world today needs hope and inspiration and environmental solutions. And so you see me more in green, yellow, and orange. Orange is hopeful inspiration, but at the same time, forceful drive of a message because of the urgency that if you lose that moment, we might not be able to get it back again.
Well, Richard, on that inspiring note and that intentional color in your life, thank you for bringing your beautiful bright yellow shirt to this conversation. Congratulations. Thank you for the incredible inspiration you are sharing with the youth of Africa and around the world. God bless you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Anne. It's been a great pleasure, and I really appreciate you for taking your time to engage me. And it's been so enjoyable that at least I had fun doing this. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Well, we'll be doing this again.
The world is on red alert and in crisis. Global warming is one of the biggest existential threats of our time. Talking to Dr. Richard Munang, Africa's environment hero, multiple award winner, and sustainability champion, provokes radical new thinking and innovative, bold action. So what are we dealing with? Well, sometimes it feels as though we're living in a perpetual crisis, right? And yet, despite the kind of enticement, we cannot simply erect a firewall, excuse the pun, to contain this intensifying global warming that transcends our national and international borders. So how do we deal with this crisis? How do we innovate, adapt, and transform? Well, there are two distinct phases. The first is the emergency phase, where we stabilize the crisis and buy more time. We often seek and ask our authority figures to give us the quick technical fix. And after a raging fire or a rising flood, to come in with the teams and clean up, fix up, and hopefully restore most of what was there before. The second phase, the adaptive phase, is much more tricky. We need to tackle the underlying causes of the crisis. We need to build new skills and capacity beyond the existing technical skills in order for us to not only survive, but thrive in a new reality. And yet it is so much harder to change the way we think, act, and lead. People will put you under enormous pressure to maintain the status quo, to address their anxieties with an authoritative confidence, often asking you or requiring of you that you sell more than you do know and discount what you don't. And despite the risk, we must resist the temptation to fake it or allegedly fix it and be bold enough to lead. There's some critical questions. What is the nature of the challenge? Is it technical? Is it adaptive? Or is it both? In the case of global warming, some of the technical challenges are to come up with cost-effective alternatives to burning fossil fuels. The adaptive challenge requires that we rewire and reset the system, that we challenge and change the rules of the game, what we do, what we say, how we think, and how we lead. There's 6 practical steps that you can follow. And in fact, Richard has applied all of these 6 steps in several innovative projects across the African continent. Firstly, experiment. He created an incubation hub. Secondly, you need to foster adaptation and balance competing demands. In other words, excel at old practices like subsistence farming while practicing the new best practice like new clean energy solutions. Thirdly, you need to embrace disequilibrium. It is good to feel uncomfortable. Stability is a liability, not an asset. If there is no crisis, there is no urgency and no change. Number 4, it also requires that despite the disequilibrium, we need to manage and moderate the heat. We need to create discomfort, yes, but we need to produce a productive zone of disequilibrium. If the temperature is too low, there will not be the difficult conversations and discussions. However, if the temperature is too high, people often panic and freeze. Number 5, we need to generate a level of leadership beneath the top. No top team alone can come up with the best innovative solutions. It is the youth of Africa that are experimenting and practicing new skills to come up with profitable, clean energy solutions for their communities. And finally, perhaps most significantly, you need to take great care of yourself. You need to take care of your outlook, your sanctity, and your professional and personal identities. When the going gets tough, it is often that strong inner sense of personal identity that pulls us through. So until next time, remember that leading boldly is about making thoughtful, clear choices. And bold leadership is about taking bold action, just one small step at a time. One step for you, but together, a giant step for humanity. So take care and take thoughtful, bold action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog and never miss an episode by subscribing at anne-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon, share with your friends, sign up on anne-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? Because the world needs you to lead boldly too.